Hello everyone, today we talk about the history of the northern kingdoms during the low Middle Ages, essentially. This is gonna be not even an introduction to the topic, but more a premise that might be useful when because I will, at least I hope, if I will leave for it to the proper history of essentially Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And why do I need to do this? Well, there are certain trivial reasons, such as the fact that I don't know very much about the history of northern countries at that in that epoch. At least not as much as I know for other regions of Europe during the Middle Ages. But secondly, but also for reasons that are a bit more consistent and that have to do mainly with the say the general idea, conception, picture, call it as you like, that we have of the history of northern countries. And I'm talking really here about the Scandinavians plus obviously the Danish. So I'm just using northern countries not by in this restrictive sense, geographically speaking, not leaving aside, of course, British history or even the rest of Baltic history that obviously was into which the northerners, the Germanic populations of Scandinavian Jutland heavily interfered, but that had other populations on their own. But really, because I believe it's pretty much evident that the only reason why people are interested in Scandinavian history, it seems, in popular culture on average, Vikings. I like Viking history. I can't say I love it because I don't know it that much, but generally speaking, I'm very fascinated by Viking history. I try not to touch any cultural prejudice whatsoever, since in fact Vikings have been portrayed in this insane way. I'm saying insane for really thinking at how the Vikings rose into popular culture to everything and its opposite, basically, depending on who is judging. I try to do that as a medievalist and as someone who at least wants to really picture the past in most accurate way that we can do, historically speaking. Up to now, if you've been following my videos, you probably noticed that I didn't talk much about northern history. I made a video about the Vikings responding to one of Schola Gladiatoria's considerations. It was I think my very first video, into which I discussed the usual moral problems that revolve around the Viking lifestyle. So the idea that of piracy, of and all it involves. And I kind of followed this track in the sense I kind of lined up in the row of people who approach Viking history. Just I admit it was a bit of clickbaiting needs. It was my first video. Come on, I don't do those things anymore. But I also generally thought if you want to check that out, I think it's interesting because I tend to maybe relativize, even though I'm definitely not a fan of relativism, the debate whether the Vikings as such, as if there had been just one kind of person that can be qualified as a Viking in a kind of unchanged mode throughout all Viking history, and really trying to see how the contact of the Vikings with other populations was sometimes much more complex than what we usually think just about pillaging and all. It also saw substantial cooperation between maybe certain minor aristocrats who wanted maybe to autonomize themselves from central rule, and that therefore maybe even allied with Viking bands to destroy I don't know, a neighboring hostile lord and all this stuff. But that's in that video if you're interested. But the point I wanted to make is, kind of explaining why I don't talk about Northern history so much. One reason is actually clear. I don't know much, neither about Viking history, telling the truth. But secondly, also because objectively, relatively to the rest of European history, and I'm sorry to say this, and I don't mean any negative thought by this, no offense, but I mean, we can say that the history of these countries was something that had a relatively small impact compared to other cultures in Europe. Not that in this sense we shouldn't study Northern history because it was less influential than we think, but I would just like to make understand in my videos about medieval history how there are many more important things that happened in Europe, even during the Viking Age, that nobody cares about because all they think is about Vikings. So some of them will probably get offended and unsubscribe from my channel saying, "Oh wow, how can you say that? The Vikings were so enormously influential and the northern countries were so influential." Well, actually, not so much. The Vikings were extremely influential indeed, but there were other peoples that basically did the same in terms of influence and far exceeded the influence that the Northerners had, and especially in relatively limited areas of Europe that there are incidentally the North and Baltic seas. And yeah, they went everywhere, they went elsewhere, they went practically everywhere, but this is something that kind of had already happened in some fashion. If you think about the late Roman Empire, the migration era, you find, I don't know, Frankish pirates into the Eastern Mediterranean, and the fact that they're not so documented, or that certain national historiographies concentrated so much about that, it's not really an excuse to say that that is less important. The reason why people like and know so much about Vikings, it's that British historiography made it a very important part of itself, because obviously of the impact that the Northmen had on the British islands. And therefore, since British historiography has been so massively influential into our Western world at least, and much that is known also about the Western world outside of it is usually through British, or at least Anglo-Saxon linguistically meant historiography, that kind of everyone knows who the Vikings were. If you ask, I don't know, instead about Ottonian Germany, or about, I don't know, even the same big things like Byzantine Empire, or that are the respective of what was happening in the West in terms of imperial rule, or even the same history of places like even the Slavic world, that was a pretty big thing at the time, or Italy, that was so much overdeveloped and was producing very skilled and enterprising sailors on its own. Or if you take the Caliphate of Cordoba in Spain, or if you take just even the events of France, even if it wasn't including the role that the Vikings had in there, but from the strictly Western Frankish perspective, you'll see that there was so much more to know. And I think that popular culture in this sense is really not just because as long as someone talks about history, even with these kind of differences, it's fine, really, because the more you talk about Vikings, the better it is, in my opinion, as any other thing in history. But the problem is that popular culture has also kind of instrumentalized the Vikings. Like, I think that all this great emphasis towards this interest towards Viking history comes from wrong directions. I'm not really meaning that politically speaking, which would be also important and interesting to discuss, but also and especially in terms of sheer historical accuracy. Because aside, the very basic stuff about Vikings, it's not that people know that much, including me, by the way, on on the actual story of local history, like Sweden or Denmark or Norway, trying to highlight the major differences um, of these communities, and really understanding their lifestyle, their differences, their relation with other countries and all. There are obviously many people, scholars. I know personally one colleague of mine who was a former PhD, and he went even working into Scandinavia. He's really passionate. That's really where the direction to follow. I understand that average people are not even interested to get that kind of education, and it's fine as well. But it is also true that many people in this sense just do not care about historical accuracy at the point of kind of picturing their own history based on basically very arbitrary beliefs, and really instrumentalizing it also politically, also religiously, also in many ways that from one side or another, doesn't matter whether we're talking about I don't know, white supremacists or people who hate Vikings because they were white. It doesn't matter if we're talking about the ultra fanatic Christian who has to demonize the Vikings because of or about the neo-pagan that has to idealize them as heroes and all. I'm just talking about even the average balanced perceptions in here that are really about how we picture history in our culture, and how we sometimes do more harm than good in a certain sense. I don't know, maybe still the fact of talking about it pushes people to kind of want to know more. But if you see what the access of the average person is to Viking history or Scandinavian history in general, is pretty miserable. And therefore I will try my best, even if I'm not an expert, to kind of talk about these stories and really even just, I think that this premise is very important in the first place, because if you have never bothered yourself to study Scandinavian history, the Middle Ages, aside from the Vikings, or not, I mean including the Vikings, I think it's still important to think of yourself putting into relation with this story in an objective way. And that's hard, because this is what basically history has been created for. It's not an easy thing. Oceans of ink have been shed to debate about history, to debate about such topics. So what I will try today is just to offer maybe a little perspective about even something else, about the northern history. And I would like to start from a low medieval point of view, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, and especially stressing the particular characteristics of the institutional development of the northern kingdoms, plural. You'll say, if you don't even speak English correctly, why do you want? Well, I know someone understands me. Anyway, so I hope to be acceptable, at least in my speech. And this is a very big topic. I mean, to me, Viking history is fascinating in many ways, because it implies here it's not really the historian talking, but more like the ungrown kid that thinks about Viking history. Is brilliantly fascinating. The idea of it's really an anthropological taste, the one of being more attracted by the idea of the warrior than to the idea of the, I don't know, the bureaucrat or the merchant, or maybe in the case of Vikings, warriors and merchants at that point was the same thing. So this makes it more shaded and fascinating, but it's not a Viking prerogative, by the way. The institutional development of the kingdoms of Norway, Sweden and Denmark, I think, are kind of interesting because they're, first of all, kind of continuing on the furrow of the ancient Germanic tradition that had produced from that region of Europe even phenomena like the Viking ones. And it's all the more interesting because it's also comparable with the development of other kingdoms at the time. Another interesting point in this sense is really the problem of this creation, because it was a very slow process. The northern monarchies weren't strong at all, but in this sense we should look at this moment as, you know, really about the efforts that it took to achieve that. I mean, it's not that the northern countries took a lot to shape themselves into monarchies because they were better or worse than anyone. It's just that there were conditions that you have to understand in order to explain that, and that actually show a great effort from not just from central power or centralizing power, but also from the commoners, the freemen. So it's this eternal struggle between centralization and freedom in many ways, really. What is interesting about the Scandinavian countries that is in this sense they can be also considered as aside from their ethnic base that was dominantly Germanic, if not exclusively in a culture, you know, in ethnical sense, mentally, culturally meant. I mean, already Tacitus was writing back in the day that basically the countries of the north, Germany, but also the Germans that inhabited the Baltic and the North Sea were kind of the least mixed peoples at the time, because nobody had ever had the crazy idea of migrating in such a cold and wild environment like that one was. And this is a very important factor to bear in mind, in the sense that indeed those were some of the most backwards and primitive and wild areas of the continent. Even the Baltic areas, the non-Germanic ones, sometimes developed, also in ancient times, by the way, sometimes quite developed cultures that were more advanced even than the one of the far north. And the reason is obvious, considering the climate, considering the technological potential that could be used to kind of struggle against that climate. So in this sense, the Northman society has to be understood on the light of that. You can't grow too much into a land that is cold. Northern Europe in this sense remained until the low Middle Ages backwards compared to Southern Europe, essentially for this reason: temperature. So simple, but it made really a really big difference. Another point was also scarce demographic density, which also creates problems in the sense that it tends to really push against centralization, in the sense that when societies are more when a lot of people tend to live together, they more fastly tend to give themselves a kind of overly directed rule. This happens, by the way, also because incidentally, those societies were also richer and very often less egalitarian than the primitive ones. In fact, the Germanic culture at this time was sensibly more egalitarian, but not because these people were inspired by such divine feelings toward their neighbors. It's just that they simply lived alone, so nobody bothered them in practice. If you lived instead in another place where there are emperors and kings, obviously you're gonna at least fight to keep out of their rule, and in that occasion, like it happened for the Germanic peoples in many ways, you have to unite, and even at that point giving yourself an orderly asset on the base of which someone else can kind of take advantage of you. The Scandinavia in general was, however, seen exactly because of this reason since ancient times as a place that it was literally called into ancient sources the vagina of peoples. Why is that? Because indeed it was felt, especially during the migration era, broadly meant that we can even make start before the late empire. Think about the Cimbri and the Teutonics in even before Christ, 2nd century BC. These areas were characterized in this sense by a more direct dependence on on agriculture. So when major climate changes occurred, even though things are probably more complicated in some measure, but let's say that in such primitive societies, the whole thing is the whole problem is more simplified, because we know that there weren't so many other different factors compared at least to more developed societies. There would be a need for migration, because the local resources might not, you might have had this population growth because maybe the crop rate was higher thanks to climate warming, but then the whole thing could crumble as well. There could be an overbreeding, let's say, a population, and as it happened for the Germans, that really mostly came from there, they began to expand elsewhere, and this was typical really of all the Indo-European peoples. This happened also in other regions of Europe, like in Gaul, like in Italy. It would be part of the traditional local tradition that, I don't know, the young males at a certain point, they had to leave home as warriors and to go fight to seize other pastures or land, in a completely warlike minded mindset, a completely warlike mindset, and therefore expanding. So since, as I was saying, Scandinavia was the region of Europe that was probably more susceptible of such changes, waves and waves of Scandinavians at a certain point were injected into Europe exactly for this reason. And there weren't really many, demographically speaking, but they were pretty much angry. I'm kidding. I mean, they were tribal societies that put a lot of emphasis on war. On tribal warfare. I mean, the idea that the freeman didn't have to work the land, for instance, even if many did in practice, but that he had to be a warrior and to seize lands and take slaves in there and to have those slaves working for them. And this is basically what the Germanic society had been about. I mean, if you look at the migration era as well, you see that all these Germanic or pseudo-Germanic peoples, because there is also the problem of how much they actually mix with other stocks like the Sarmatians or the Turks and all, but say that they were at least culturally dominantly Germanic. actually always retained a pretty strong contact with the Scandinavian motherland. I mean, many peoples that were, for instance, knocked out by during the migration era by their neighbors, if they didn't get assimilated by those neighbors, they sometimes came back to Scandinavia, even if they had spent literally centuries, maybe into the very center of Europe, and haven't not dwelled into Scandinavia since in fact a lot of time. But peoples like the Goths, the Longobards, and many others, think at the early or were actually quite aware and quite pretty much in contact with the far north, which they considered as their land of origin. There were also in Roman times a lot of there is evidence of northern men who basically left their home from, say, the Jutland Peninsula, and they would come to work as soldiers, as federati for the Roman military. They took their own, reward for that, and what would they do? Would they Romanize? Not really. They came back their home, proudly saying that I fought into the Roman army, because it wasn't really felt even as anything like an opposition of civilization between the Germans and the Romans. The Germans were actually much more positively attracted by the Roman Empire than we think. They thought they were best, obviously, because their warlike culture made them aware that the Germans had to be the best of all. But the Romans were normally the Roman Empire was kind of a natural harbor for these people. And if you look at the Viking Age, when the cycle, let's say, kicked in once again with this expansion of what we think has been essentially a demographic reason for the outburst of the Scandinavians out of their homeland. Where did they go? They went into the Mediterranean. They went where there was money, where people could hire them as mercenaries, because they were naturally warriors. They had been raised into that society, and so you find them dwelling as imperial guards in Constantinople, and fighting for the empire to recover Sicily, to do actually a lot of things in other lands, including becoming feudal owners of the French, feudal vassals of the French king, of Western Frankish king in Normandy, famously, or settling into England. That definitely at the time of the Norman conquest was essentially an Anglo-Danish country, and also far away into America, into the stretch up to Kazakhstan, and even at the end of the Viking Age, which is conventionally placed also here in a very British perspective into 1066, but it's a good date in my opinion. If we want to approximate it, they retained that kind of lifestyle for a good other century at least, if not more. So just for saying that there is a very progressive history of these peoples that you can these are not very well documented areas in general, because we know about it, maybe just about the far northeast of Europe we know less than into Scandinavia and the Jutland, and even there are considerable differences in the sense that Danish history is much better documented than, say, Swedish history. So there are even historical reasons sometimes why we kind of ignore certain periods, but there is still pretty much substantial knowledge to say. So, and what I was trying to say, my excursus are very long, is that there was a kind of similarity between this Germanic region of Europe and the Slavic one. Even in origin, I mean, the Indo-Europeans all come out of the same stock, essentially, so sometimes it's difficult into the northern forests to say, these were Slavs and these were Germans. It's not that they were tagged, most of them wouldn't even consider themselves in such ways, but there were kind of similar lifestyles, also, tribalism, a certain even right for as much as we know. Unfortunately, much of the informations that we have about law of the Germans and of the Slavs, of the early Germans and the early Slavs, is pretty much unknown to us, if not through very late sources that were quite different. But just for saying that there are kind of similarities into this, and that in the low Middle Ages emerge in the sense that the institutional development of these areas from a political point of view was definitely slower. I mean, the great monarchies of Europe in this sense came from essentially Western and Southern Europe. Even England, that is a northern country, geographically speaking, was actually pretty much. England is a very fascinating example. I mean, I'm talking about here the low Middle Ages. So obviously, the Norman Kingdom of England was actually an emanation of of France as a model. Although we must say that the English, in this sense, were the Anglo-Saxons before the Norman conquests definitely shared a lot of with Scandinavian cultures, and they actually had one of the most advanced administrative systems into a pretty good, solid monarchy in many ways, that in this sense brought. I mean, if Hastings had been won by the Anglo-Saxons, I don't know. Surely there have the strong ties between England and the Scandinavian world might have continued for much longer. The whole world history would have been completely different today, and so on. But England was a bit different environmentally speaking from Scandinavia. Like the lowlands of England are pretty good fertile areas. They had been in this sense Romanized, so there was already the base for building something more developed. Scandinavia was really the utter almost depressed areas of the continent. So it's obvious that even those resources that were needed to even physically build a kingdom were of more difficult access, and society was shaped in a way that in this sense pushed even against to this process. So the major evidence, however, that we have is that relatively to what the northern kingdoms had in common with the western ones and the southern ones, was that they were essentially monarchic, princely political entities with certain representative assemblies that, in this sense, like in the rest of Europe, had their own share of saying and had a kind of corporate interest, especially against the centralizing push of the monarch. But for the rest, we'll see that differences are pretty much strong. And I will do it more detailed into other videos. Today I would like to name just in very great outline what major differences were. So as we were saying, progressively the kingdoms of Sweden, Norway and Denmark were formed. Their stories are kind of a bit different, considering that they're pretty different countries themselves, and they kind of specialized in some different ways. They definitely also took different directions of expansion. First of all, we should start with Denmark. That is definitely the most important at this point. And the Kingdom of Denmark is what it was the most powerful. Essentially, it was Denmark. Is this flatland peninsula with therefore considerable agricultural resources, also fishing, of course, but it's still an area that has kind of a strong agrarian. It's also in latitude. It's more in the south compared, so it's kind of warmer compared to certain parts of Sweden, at least in most of Norway. And it is a place into which, in this sense, a more stratified society had developed. It had developed also here for essentially the agricultural surplus that was available that allowed these Danish communities to kind of invest considerably into certain enterprises. And there was definitely the 10th century. I mean, the Danes were kind of already a defined entity on their own, and the Danish monarchy traces back his origin because to at least the 10th century roughly. So it was an extremely progressive phenomenon. It happened also for endogenous reasons, in the sense that the Danes bordered with the Franks at one point. Now the Franks were this military might that had already wiped out the Danish neighbors, the Saxons. They were in this sense considerably akin to the Danes. And into which also the role of religion had definitely had an important part, because Charles the Great was invading territories not just for the most obvious need of conquest every people has in a certain sense, but also by exporting certain ecclesiastical structures that were definitely instrumental to controlling the populations into pagan lands. And the Danes had a kind of, the Franks thought about fighting against the Danes. It was also warfare in some measure. For instance, the fact that the Franks knocked out the Frisians in northern Holland, and the Frisians were pirates even before the Scandinavians, and it seemingly, people say, the fact that there weren't Frisian pirates anymore, and the Franks were not much of this at all of a sea power, even though they tried to put up some ships, some fleets at one point, kind of opened new space to people like the Danes, who were the ones who, by the way, among the other Northmen, took more seriously the way of conquest oversea. The Norwegians were like kind of more the explorers of the situation. They were forced by their own territory that has basically mountains just over the sea to expand more than others, because they had less fields to cultivate, to have resources, so it would be natural to simply go by sea. But there were also less people in this sense. They also had a smaller demographic force, so even if they eventually in this sense emigrated from Norway and settled into various areas like Scotland, then Ireland, eventually Iceland, Terra Nova and all, Greenland, they kind of remained the lesser power among the Northmen. The Danes were the guys who were wealthier, who in this sense were more centralized, because their aristocracy at least controlled more people, more of the population. And also they were also pushed by the so-called metus hostilis, that was the fear of the enemy, and namely of the Franks. Of the Franks at a certain point fall, and the Danes obviously take the opportunity to eat this dying giant of the Carolingian Empire. By the way, Scandinavian piracy was partly triggered also by this. We shouldn't think that at a certain point these guys left from Scandinavia or from Denmark because just climate change kicked in. All the times in history into which there is a crumbling power, there are either brigands or pirates that pop out, magically speaking, and it's simply the same people that were living there before that saw fit to go take their share of the dying, their share of the cake. But by the 10th century, Saxon Germany, in the sense of Teutonian Germany, kind of rose as a consistent power. The center of the Carolingian Empire had been kind of northern France, Belgium, that weren't really bordering Denmark. Saxony, the Teutonian Saxony, was bordering Denmark. And these guys were already not Christianized formally, so that they got Christianized for the first time by Harald Bluetooth, the son of Gorm, into 965. And the reason why these guys became Christians is that the Germans were keeping to expand their own empire. They were a threatening menace. And being formally pagan in this sense was kind of even of a political, taking a political side. So the Harald that in this sense is already remembered as king of Denmark as well as of Norway, which tells you, by the way, what, even if namely the influence of Denmark really was at the time in the northern world, decided to convert, so to formally accept Christianity and to become a Christian empire. By the way, the Danes had launched assaults into Saxony. There have been some warfare in this sense. They had even destroyed dioceses founded by the Germans, and that was kind of we don't have to think it was really about religion. It was really about other things, and definitely destroying an archdiocese meant even to do a considerable political and economical damage aside from just saying we're destroying a Christian center in practice. At one point Denmark, however, was too weak to withstand a German expansionism, and they decided to keep them a bit away. I mean, the menace, the threat wasn't ended. By the way, also Teutonian Saxony wasn't this huge power that we can imagine. I mean, they basically ruled effectively only on Saxony and Franconia. They went in Italy part of times just to be recognized formally, but they didn't even rule all over Germany at that point. So even against Denmark, and we don't have to think that there was this excessive difference in this sense between Saxony or Denmark at the time. So this this was ongoing still in the full of Viking times. So it's also interesting to see how actually the Danes were, as Vikings, were kind of getting Christianized in part, even though we have to imagine that they largely retained their pagan beliefs, because the first ones to Christianize are the guys at the top for political reasons. Then I must say that also this great resistance to Christianization, telling the truth, into Germanic society is a bit of a myth. If you study Icelandic history, you realize that basically in 2 generations that they had fully Christianized, and from a pagan point of view, the idea of accepting another god together with your own, if you can't do that because these weren't really oppressed by a foreign ruler, was something normal, was something that wasn't seen as terrible as someone or as insulting as someone might do. By the way these peoples were Christianized sometimes even passed through a kind of an adaptation of the Bible, of the Gospels. Like Jesus was pictured like a warlord, with the apostles being his own warriors, and when Saint Peter cuts the legionary's ear, he kind of is portrayed like an Oscar or and all. I mean, this was also done. You know, the same concept of Christian faith was equated in this sense to make it understood into the Northman society as the same fealty, the same loyalty that existed between a warlord and his retinue. So something that could be understood also in those means. By the way, at this time, the Danish kingdom kind of even began to build structural, let's say, infrastructures, especially fortifications, to even define the spaces of this kingdom, like fortresses, the very famous Dannevirke, that was a basically a system of fortifications that was meant to kind of were kind of ditches and trenches, not to let the enemy pass. It was really initiated much earlier, but in this sense, the Danish monarchy was kind of even re-expanding in front of the local populations as a leading power that was taking care of that in the name of the Danes. So it was something really played like this. And the Danes this time also obviously had, if you think about Canute the Great, who united even Denmark and England and Norway for almost 30 years by going around with this Scandinavian army. It was something very unstable. Like, you have to think of instability as a macroscopical datum of these kingdoms' events. These weren't permanent, they were mostly nominal dominions. They were just recognized formally. There were tributes to pay, naturally. There was really an income from this. But the structures really to maintain these dominions wasn't really wasn't there simply. And however, Denmark began to eventually expand into southern Sweden, Scania, Halland and Blekinge, then eventually also into the Baltic countries, into Danish Estonia, and even into Germany in part, because the regions of Schleswig and Holstein were kind of always these frontier areas were fought between the Germans and Denmark. Then I will get later to the Kalmar Union as a conclusive consideration for both for all of the three kingdoms we're really talking about. The Kingdom of Sweden, and I mean, just for concluding about Denmark, it was the country that also the kingdom, the monarchy, let's say better, that was mostly influenced by the Frankish culture that inherited feudalism earlier, that imitated the Franks earlier. And these influences were definitely very useful instruments for Danish kings to impose themselves into the Danish freemen, in the sense that these were regions that had a very large degree of local autonomy and all, and the feudalization of the northern countries passed exactly to this force of local prominent aristocracies that tried to transform themselves into feudal kings, to transform their country into a feudal dominion, which was a very tough thing to do because of the degree of political fragmentation and actual lack of resources into the actual land to do that. The Vikings went abroad sometimes to sack and to take the wealth back into their own lands, because that was much easier and much more convenient than waiting for the crop rate to to provide them from that wealth. So it was normal, and on the basis of that booty they could eventually keep not really people much subjected, but at least attached to them, maybe to finance greater armies that could take greater booty, and to in minimal part beginning to structurate something more centralized in their own domains. The history of Sweden is a bit more unknown, especially in the beginnings. There are this kind of there is this mythical past also that kind of transcends history at a certain point, in the sense that kingly figures were always there in all these countries, but sometimes they belong to the myth, to the sagas that are not really factual history, and they maybe bear the reminiscence of certain leaders that had been there, but maybe in very different contexts than in the way of the ones that in which they were narrated, or and we can know a really few. Famously enough, Sweden was really the northern part of Sweden today, or better, not really the northernmost part is Norrland, the far north, into which I'm sure neither Germans dwelled. It was populated, I think, by Sami people. But we're talking about the kind of north of the south of Sweden. It was Sweden proper, like Svealand. The other one was Gothia, or Götaland, not to be confused with the actual island of Gotland that actually was battled between this the Swedish, let's say, and the Goths, if we can call them improperly this way. Actually, Beowulf narrates the semi-legendary Swedish-Jadish wars between during the mythical 7th century, that so much gained to this migration here. It was perceived indeed as you have Iceland. Excuse me. Northern sagas are pretty much reminiscent of the migration era. It's not something that was written really of the reason why so many sagas actually talk about that period is that it was seen like a grand moment into which these peoples from the north began to move, to conquer, to interact even with great masters. Think about in the Burgundian cycle the figures of Attila, of the Roman general Aetius. I mean, it was a world that at that point had kind of looked at the outer world, and that had definitely had knowledge of the rest of the world. We don't have to think of these guys really just thinking about their tiny villages into Sweden, but really thinking of a greater world that they were trying to really to penetrate once again into the Viking Age, in the sense that the Swedes were actually the ones who took the riverways of Russia as pirates, as tradesmen, as warriors, and even creating lordships into Russia proper. Eventually they were absorbed by the Slavs, but really the Varangians, the Rus, have partly this Swedish origin, or at least this Northman or northern origin, broadly meant, and in Christianity was introduced by into the 9th century, but actually in Sweden it took basically a lot of time before paganism was actually only formally replaced, in the sense that I'm sure Sweden in many areas, also in modern age, was a pagan country. In some, obviously, in modern age, only in some far areas, but there was still a consistent, because really converting to religion at that point. And this is what I want to stress about the low medieval history of these northern monarchies, is that it was a political tool for monarchies to centralize, because they could get money to found dioceses, to find monasteries, so to structurate a dynastic net of relations that obviously, you know, the church in this sense belonged to, we can say, to the aristocracy, princesses, or were, I don't know, could be used also as great, could become very, like it had happened quite simply into the rest of Europe, into which the ecclesiastical world had been monopolized at one point by the aristocracies, especially in post-Carolingian times, but also before. So this was a way to control really better the territory and its populations, while the rest of the populations already wanted to leave their own way, the old traditional way, in some measure. But the interesting thing is that the Swedes were also leaving into this Baltic Sea, that is a kind of a miniaturized Mediterranean. There are certain people who have crazily, because it's wrong, we don't know anything about that, thought that the Iliad set place into the Baltic Sea, for stressing really how land is lands are kind of close there, so there is a kind of natural push towards, if you look at the map here, you can go in many places, like, so you're kind of encouraged when land is so close to eventually go abroad. And this happened probably more in Sweden than in other in Norway and Denmark, because the North Sea, the Atlantic Ocean, is pretty an amazing obstacle. Even if obviously both the Danes and Norwegians did that, they probably those missions looked as more serious enterprises that had to be taken every once in a while with a certain good investment and preparation. In Sweden, probably the contact with the Baltic countries, with Finland, was probably historically much closer. Look at how here Gotland is close to Lithuania, or how Swedish Finland here is close to Estonia, or here with even with Denmark. You see that the Danish, because of their power, began to colonize the Scania, the southern region of Sweden. Plus obviously contacts with Norway, but even here there were other peoples like the Prussians, the Pomeranians, the Poles, you know, the Germans. So lots of different peoples that also in this sense stimulate the just interaction, because you can find allies against your enemies there. And as we've seen, the Swedes eventually arriving up to Constantinople with their trades and even beyond. But the process of creating a monarchy in Sweden was much slower. We can't say that it was mostly the aristocracies that had got the upper hand, in at least relatively to Denmark. It was more structured and centralized, as we have seen. And there was probably in Sweden also a higher degree of free trade in many ways. Definitely the Swedes were kind of the greater traders among the Vikings. And eventually, since we're talking really about low Middle Ages, so here even about in post Viking times, there was the development of the Hanseatic League in the Baltic and in the North Sea, by the Germans, by the German maritime republics, we can call them. Now the Hanseatic League as a wall was a pretty amazing feat. It was created exactly because individually these northern German cities weren't that strong like other maritime republics like in the Mediterranean, but altogether could really make the difference. They lived away from in this time the German monarchy was progressively falling apart, so the Hanseatic League kind of spread because it was uncontrolled in this sense. The Scandinavian monarchies were weak, so they expanded quite fast. They usually made a west-east trade route from Russia to England, vice versa. And they were kind of competing with the Northerners. So this would in turn push, as we will see, the northern countries to unite against it in some ways. But we have to think that definitely the Swedes were kind of competitors, together also with the Danes of the Hanseatic League, and that's the reason why they joined together. But trade and piracy was well active also in the Baltic Sea, and you see also how the Swedes expanded into Finland. Basically, the Finns today are the Finlandese people are largely descendants of Swedish settlers, and that came to arrive into this time. It's very important to think that these Scandinavian countries, also Denmark, kept declining their kind of Viking vocation eventually in Christian times into as crusaders. There are great expeditions that they made into the Mediterranean, into the Holy Land. Famously, I'd say the most important one was the one of Sigurd of Norway, that we will be seeing here in a while. That had kind of you have to think that the Normans in here at this time were also present in England, in Sicily, even if they were something very different, also in Normandy. And the Sicilians, the English, they were kind of crusaders at that point. So sometimes when you see these northerners eventually enter into the Mediterranean, passing to Norman Sicily and all, you have to think that these peoples were kind of very different, but still recognized at an aristocratic level the fact that the Norman origin was out there, that the Viking Age had spread the Normans so far away, but they still retain a kind of common origins, common stock, partly common language and traditions and all. And part of the great Norman chivalry romance, we can say, derives definitely by the channeling of this ancient tribal and warlike lifestyle that the Northmen had before being feudalized, and before being first of all before being Christianized, and then before being feudalized. Passing to Norway. Now Norway, as we were saying, was kind of the weakest among these Nordic monarchies, because look at the geography, you simply understand that Norway had seen intense trade even with the Rhine Valley since the ancient times, Roman times, etc. But it didn't have much room for expansion. Yet these guys, exactly for this reason, prefer to go by sea than by land. And that's why they achieved so many great feats in terms of exploration in the search of searching for new land. Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. There were kind of alternate phases into Norwegian history. There were early times into which like even the 9th century, so we're talking about a very early stage into which nominally a king, Harald I Fairhair, had kind of claimed um, the unification of the Norwegian communities inhabiting all these um, kind of spaces between the fjords and other the few flatland areas that are present in Norway, and so these were really, it wasn't really a kingdom, it was more a kingly system. Like there were many petty kingdoms of Norway that could recognize as a temporarily as one of the most powerful of them to be preeminent and maybe being reverent towards him. After all, this was normal at every level of society. There were several clans that usually waged war against each other, then maybe they traded, then they fought again, and obviously one had to eventually kind of bend the other. Sometimes they didn't even have the demographical or economical strength to kind of phagocytate them and to create something greater. So sometimes these subjugations basically consisted in just receiving a tribute, like a we say tribute as if something so brightly sounding, but this is not very different from the mob, really. Either you pay us or we're gonna destroy you, and this is pretty much how old tribal societies worked, and it's not surprising in the regions to which today the mob is still present, is usually where there is a weak state into that area. So the tribe is essentially the payoff, hush money, and it also involves protection indeed. So the idea of creating a kingdom really laid on this basis. We can say, however, that there were very complicated alternated events, but we can say that the Kingdom of Norway reached the peak of power around in the 13th century, let's say at the mid, or even probably before the first half of the 13th century. And this was also the time of Sigurd I that led the Norwegian crusade, fighting famously it interfered in the history of Portugal for having actually won Lisbon to the Muslims, and having kind of freed that, and there were also Englishmen and Frenchmen fighting together with them. He fought also into the Balearic Islands, and he participated to the siege of Sidon, into the Near East, into Sidon being still today the largest city in Lebanon. And he fought alongside other characters like Baldwin of Boulogne, who was the first Count of Edessa, by the way. So someone who didn't come also that far from a kind of Norman-influenced area. And also with the Venetians, interestingly, you know, the Venetians at the time were kind of expanding as well in sea, and they were pretty an advanced maritime power, and that's what I was saying at the beginning of the video. Why don't we talk about the everybody knows about the Vikings, nobody cares about the Venetians as a military power. And so it's even interesting to see in this sense essentially a 12th century Norwegian king. It was pretty similar to the one of the Viking Age in practice, even getting acquainted with a Venetian Doge and of his navy, and maybe confrontating on military, on naval engineering, on practices. It would be interesting to know more, but unfortunately I don't think there is so much about that. In this time, the also the exploration of America was taking place. Um, the there was also kind of these strictly originally egalitarian kingdoms, like the one of Norway, that recognized sort of a unified code of law. I mean, very egalitarian measures apparently to the whole country, known as the Magnus or Magnus Lagabotus. I don't know if I pronounce him right. State law. Magnus Lagabotus Landslov should be, in the original language, which in this sense was kind of declaration of of uniformity. I'm saying really declaration here because it's not that he could really impose this law into the country, but it was really the country that had, in this sense, in a very homogeneous way, such traditions that were sanctionized as a political measure by this king. There were kings that were still struggling for actually controlling the whole Norwegian communities. That wasn't an easy task to do with such few resources and lack of centralization in practice. Then, as we know, eventually there were also certain dynastic switchings. There were at the time kings of Norway were also kings of Sweden. There was this kind of interaction between the Northmen, and was a kind of increasing influence from especially from Denmark. And what I would like to arrive to is that into this, so kind of reuniting the history of these lands, is that in all these three kingdoms, feudalism and the idea of a monarchy had developed. In the 13th century and the 14th, this, even if with very peculiar characteristics that I can't talk about right now because the video is already too long the way it is, kind of became similar to the other feudal powers in theory. I mean, the feudal structures were finally imposed on the Nordman freemen in the favor of resources. Europe in the 14th century, as we know, was rocketing pretty much economically speaking. Yeah, it had already a major economical crisis in the early 14th century, but what I mean is that from the rebirth of the 11th century, these European powers were, especially in the west and the south, really rocketing. If you take the Kingdom of France compared to a Scandinavian monarchy, is like a giant in front of an ant. Even other powers like the Italian lordships or Castile or even Slavic powers at this time were becoming kind of consistent. So when and you have to imagine the Scandinavians really being influenced by these traditions and trying to keep up with the political and institutional developments that were happening, that were taking place everywhere. I'm not aware of any form of major expansion was tried against these countries, in the sense that there were many other profitable lands to expand in. The same Scandinavians, at least, were the ones expanding with their newly formed feudal monarchies, expanding into still kind of relatively underdeveloped areas of Europe, like in the Baltic with the Baltic Crusades and even colonizing, like the Danes, as we've seen, colonized Estonia. There was an action, even if they basically couldn't go much deep into the hinterland, but all they mostly cared about was having a certain port or owning ports for trade. There was also consistent warfare between all these powers. Normally it was Denmark, it was on the assault on Sweden, especially for the control of other of major ports in this sense, and islands like Gotland. But the problem is that at the mid of the 14th century, the plague struck into Scandinavia as well. So this, I believe, like in other areas of the country, of Europe, sorry, favored actually the strengthening of the feudal monarchies, of the lordships in general. So this probably helped. But the problem is that was also in there major crisis that in this sense made these countries always increasingly exposed, especially to the economical penetration of the Hanseatic League of Germany. And there was also consistent warfare. The Hanseatic League actually didn't behave much differently from what the Vikings had done in the past. I mean, it was piracy, trade and all, and that's also what the Northmen did. But the Hanseatic League was a much strong power in this sense, in spite of its weaknesses were definitely present. So in 1397, the Scandinavian monarchies basically confederated into what is called the Union of Kalmar. This was a union that theoretically left the political autonomy of all the political freedom in itself of all the three northern kingdoms, but that in practice was also an attempt from, in part at least, from Denmark to extend its power over the other countries. And with Norway it was relatively easy. With Sweden a bit more difficult, because the Swedish aristocracies weren't so eager to let themselves being subjugated by the Danes, who in this sense also couldn't more than much for the same reason. But the idea was at least acting together in order to move as one against the Hanseatic League. In this sense, doing what the same Hanseatic cities had done singularly by founding their league. And this constant warfare between these powers kind of went on forever until eventually Sweden in the 17th century didn't become a major power, at least on a regional scale. Then eventually in the 18th century became something even more. But let's say that it was always fought kind of in the same places. Also, if you get the Straits in Denmark, I mean, there are certain places that saw constant naval warfare in some measure, or at least there were certain ways that couldn't be avoided, certain passages that couldn't be avoided. But the Union of Kalmar, now I should conclude the video because it's definitely too long, wasn't really something, it lasted long, but it was kind of intermittent and pretty much ineffective. And however, yes, it did achieve partly its own aims. But all these three countries kind of had their different interests, so even the union implied that it was a constant degree of local political autonomy and fragmentation that really didn't help the whole thing to work. But it was an attempt to say, okay, we are similar countries, we have maybe certain common enemies sometimes, so let's try to confederate in some fashion. Then eventually the whole thing failed. But anyhow, so this is a bit of an introduction, definitely not just a consideration about the northern countries and why they are important and worth to learn about, even aside from Vikings during the medieval era. And I definitely will dedicate more time to the single countries when I when I'll have the chance. It won't happen that frequently because I talk about many other things really, but I won't abandon this topic, be sure about it. So, okay, I hope you enjoyed this video as always, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel, and to receive further notifications, if anything, for that, about the new contents I post. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.